January 6th, 1890. To most of the world, it is a normal day. But to historians looking back on this day, it is an incredible shift in society. In a place deep in the mountains of Japan known as Shinkoku, a caravan of 20 injured yokai approached the town known as Ogateshi, a town of 200 humans. The winter had been harsh, and despite the yokai's ability to sustain off of simply amrita and blood, the cold, as well as the disease and other stronger yokai, had proved too much for this gathering, and they had no other choice but to go to the humans for help. The humans waited eagerly, gathering around. Though the yokai looked weak, that did not mean they trusted them, although they were not threatened enough to bear arms directly. The yokai simply asked for help, assistance, medicine, anything to help their wounded and injured and dying. The humans, despite their distrust, agreed. If you don't know where this is exactly within the country of Japan, it is right here. The reason I'm calling out this geography is because this event, this earth-shattering event that no one knew of in the middle of nowhere on a tiny, tiny island that was inconsequential to most of the world, had begun to shift the culture of not just Japan, but the rest of the world forever. By 10 years, yokai had begun living with humans in small groups here and there, or usually around 10 at most, 2 at least. It started in Japan, but slowly made its way into other major world cities, such as New York, as well as Beijing, and other important places such as Moscow. Many of these places would have yokai in them. This transition took a long time, about 20 years. Luckily enough for the yokai and the humans both, humans had long since forgotten the unbelievable power Amrita has. Within Amrita is the power to create, the power to destroy especially, but humans had long forgotten about it, almost as if this was planned, like someone was behind this, and to an extent, there was. It had been a long since dwelling and dormant dream of a massive group of people, that humans would finally be free to live with yokai and yokai with humans. But one day soon, humans would once again remember the destructive power that Amrita can provide in the war that would end all war. July 28th, 1914. A day that would go down in history as the day the Great War officially began. Rising tensions between many countries within the Mediterranean had all begun over a series of complex and spiraling alliances, but this war had truly started by an assassination on Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Human politics never really affected yokai. It affected how many were created, but never affected yokai directly, until now. A war had started in the Mediterranean, which was unlike any war seen before. The scale and the technology was intense, and during this war, as all wars had done before, Amrita was created. There are certain zones around the planet which Amrita have a higher chance of growing in, but with this many deaths, it didn't matter that most of the war wasn't in the Asian continent. Amrita was growing everywhere. From this, yokai sprang from the battlefields, and a profession long since forgotten of yokai killing and monster slaying had come back in full force. There were many of them. People took to the job of cleaning battlefields for each country quite fast, as if part of them wanted to do this. Ex-soldiers or soldiers who can't fight on any longer, or people who had a knack for killing of monsters and yokai, attached on and did their thing. killing, slicing, and dicing, shooting and murdering all that stood up on the battlefield once again. Undead were the primary issue, but those who had a deep faith in the religious that died unjustly by their eyes were also an issue. Yokai, however, had never faced anything like this. The yokai in the past had faced men with blades, spears, and fists. But these men wielded guns, powerful firearms which the yokai of the past had never had to deal with. It caused innovation on both sides. And through this war of 4 years, humans had begun to realize the incredible potential that Amrita has once again. But it would take many more years before that power would need to be harnessed. On November 11th, 1918, years after the war's initial start, it had finally come to an end. The Treaty of Versailles, signed within the city of Versailles in France, had ended the war that would end all wars. Parades were held in victorious countries. America returned to its shores a victor, and things were beautiful. But not everyone agreed. To some, the war never ended. To some countries, such as France or Germany, still swamped by undead and yokai randomly wandering, the war was not over yet. Something was growing in the underground. Something that would be able to harness Amrita far better than the humans of the First Great War ever could. September 1st, 1939. The start of the Second World War. Unlike the previous war, which had been fueled by politics, this one had been fueled by a country having a drastic change of government. This one targeted more than just soldiers and land. This one targeted the people of those nations. The Second World War had begun, with Germany declaring war and beginning to invade Poland with their new ally, the Soviet Union. But behind Germany and their quick advance and their strong weapons was a man who had previously served in the Great War and had firsthand seen the power that yokai wield with their Amrita. This man was now the leader of Germany, and he intended to use his political power and his newly found strength to take over what he believed was rightfully Germany's. The German people were in a bad stint after the First War. The Treaty of Versailles had put them in monumental debt, and there was little they could do over the growing nationalism within their country. Amrita grew stronger and stronger. With every person that died within Poland, more Amrita sprung. Even if it was small amounts here or there, a massive amount like that could never, ever be ignored. And so, the Germans took this absurd amount of Amrita which they had come into possession of and began their long experimenting and understanding process of Amrita. They began to craft it into weapons, armor, anything they could. Some say the basics of cybernetics came from this study of Amrita, but as Amrita was studied, like all things in the past, and all people in the past that had used or had Amrita in it, it began to corrupt. By 1941, it was an official world war, as not only had America entered the war, but Canada as well. And after the 1940s, unfortunately, America had declared war more than 6 times within the last 45 years. Amrita was growing all over the earth, but there was one country that had also declared war that was more noticeable than the rest. Japan. Japan had begun to invade China during that time, and was the reason America was pulled into the war to begin with. America had went to war with Japan within the Pacific. This is what many people consider the turning point. The turning point where yokai exploded into the world and their population skyrocketed. With the experimenting of Amrita in the west and the war in the Pacific in the east, things would not be the same. While the First Great War had Japanese conflict, it was not on the scale of this one. and not in the Pacific in this kind of level. So it began. The war raged on for 4 more years, eventually culminating in one of the worst human tragedies that had ever happened, had ever been spun: the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This one action set the world into the nuclear age. Some people call it the worst evil to ever come from America. Me personally, I'd call it the worst evil that humans have ever done. And the yokai that were created from this tragedy, from the fear, from the death across the world, would agree. They were truly evil. Most undead, especially within the Pacific, but some angry spirits, ghosts, but others were humans that came into contact with the Amrita itself and became yokai. Yokai hunting was back in full force, and by 1946, after the war's end, Germany's defeat, and Japan's surrender, yokai were all over the world, undead crawling in every corner and every nook that anyone could find within the Pacific or the Mediterranean. America, however, lacked such. In fact, the entire continent lacked a huge amount of yokai, as they had never been directly attacked. However, multiple other stuttering wars continued on into the 50s, as the Cold War had begun. Rising tensions between America and the Soviet Union caused a war that could end the world. Meanwhile, Amrita was still being studied, just as the Germans had studied it before. Many countries around the world had picked up the habit of studying Amrita, as the Germans had. Technology from this was created that many could not dream of before. The basics of cybernetics, the basics of hovercrafts. It spurred the entire world into a new age. While many countries around the world were devastated, Amrita seemed like a way to go, and a corruption began to take hold in the world. But just as it had all been done before, yokai hunters came up and began to rid the world of corruption. Even those who had lived longer than the war had gone on, even those who had lived longer than the Great War had occurred. Names like William, Hideyoshi had come up again. Living immortals who are eternally on this earth simply began to do their jobs once again. By the 1970s, humans and yokai were living peacefully together. Yokai hunters had done their job as they had always done before. They lived peacefully together. Most major cities had at least 1,000, although there were some places, such as northern sections of England and places such as the Tamil Kings within India or the Vigor Empire, which had very few, if none at all. But places like America, Germany, even the Soviet Union were filled with yokai, willing to curdle their bloodlust with more milk and rice, sating them and living with humans. This was a peaceful time for most. America had been dragged into wars repeatedly, while places like the UK, London, England, France, Spain had all been rebuilding. Technology evolved quickly. Places like the Vigor Empire were on the forefront of technological advancements, and humans began to understand yokai more and more. They also began to understand that what they had now was far worse than yokai. There were fiends, fae, and things which did not come from Amrita directly, much like the Omyo magic used by humans in the past, that had also stalked the world. But unlike yokai, they were not peaceful. Unlike most yokai, they were not peaceful. These things were evil, set out to destroy. That was the greatest fear of humanity at this time. By the 1990s, people had begun to educate. Full classes of simply understanding yokai and their biology had begun to take root in colleges and curriculums around the world. The study of Amrita was accepted, although its corruptive properties were not. Some believed that Amrita couldn't corrupt one's mind. Others believed it couldn't lead to possession. Although the yokai which had it within their bodies were staunch advocates of the idea that it could. But by the year 2010, we had lived in peace for a long time. Wars within the Middle East had constantly evolved. The Mediterranean never truly settled down. Even wars such as Vietnam had continued to rage across the world since the 1940s. But in the modern era, things had calmed down a lot more, and diplomacy was seen as the primary way to deal with problems for most countries. However, in 2021, war had come back to the Mediterranean again. Over and over, war had sprung up. And now something else was coming. The dream had been realized, humans and yokai living together. But now, within this new age, a new kind of people had taken root. Shifters, the breed of human and yokai. A human with Amrita in their body. Most of the time, when a human and a yokai produce offspring, it would just simply be a yokai. The Amrita would take root in the child long before they were born and modify them. But a shifter is what happens when two creatures are created that live in the same body. A demon and a human, both occupying the same space at the same time. Shifters, however, were not received as well as their mothers and fathers would be, as shifters were seen as dangerous. They were not understood as well as Amrita itself or yokai were. They were seen as dangerous creatures that had the strength of yokai as well as the madness of a human. Worldwide, they were seen as lesser, lower-class people, like they shouldn't exist. While yokai were widely accepted, their offspring with humans were not. They were dangerous to many. But as time wore on, the stigma slowly began to disappear as more and more shifters were created. 2020, July 2nd, the Red Wave. Starting near Iwaki, Japan, the night of July 2nd, a wave of energy slowly sprouted from the city, or at least where many believe nearby the city, somewhere in the mountains. This wave of energy spread across the entire earth and was more than visible. It was almost tangible to some. Humans were mostly unaffected, but yokai were driven to insanity for a short period of time. Their eyes, once blue and gold, became red, evidence of evil or malicious intent. Amrita. Thanks to this effect, many believe this red wave was Amrita-sourced. But that wasn't the only effect the red wave had. It also threw certain members of the world, certain members of society, through time. It was believed to be completely random, and most people think it was utterly random of who was thrown forwards into time. But to those who were, they were thrown a minimum of 50 years to a maximum of 100,000 years into the future. Some don't even know when they'll resurface. Some people may never resurface. It is a strange phenomenon. For those who began to resurface 50 years later, they were given a name to describe what had happened to them, people out of time. Their names were strangers. They were thrown forwards in time, yet kept in perfect stasis. Even illnesses and diseases they were suffering from at the time were still affecting them when they had resurfaced. 2020 was a scary year overall. A pandemic had started. War was on the horizon for multiple countries. With the red wave, however, and yokai becoming rage monsters once again, people were more terrified than they ever have been. The stigma of yokai and shifters being evil monsters had long faded since 2020, but this brought that idea back into the minds of the humans once again. People were afraid. But what comes next? What comes next is real terror. What comes next? That's what they should really be afraid of. No yokai nor shifter could ever create what the world's next biggest strife would be. In the years to come, the world would learn real fear. March 6th, 2029. New York City, a standing and proud symbol of America's innovation and capitalism. Something to cherish amongst the extraordinary cities around the world. This one standing taller than the rest of them. A population of about 8 million. Beautiful. But on this particular morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, March 6th, 2029, radars had picked up a strange spherical object about 20 feet wide and 20 feet tall off the coast of the small island known as West Bank Lighthouse. This object was large and moving quickly towards Manhattan's boroughs, in particular Manhattan Island. Small excavation teams and police boats were sent out to discover whatever this object was. Many believed it was an umeboza or some form of yokai, as they had dealt with those previously. But no, what they had found was a large sphere of water with a Buddhist temple in the center of it. A small Buddhist temple made of stone, rock, and steel, magically infused with strange emerita, golden and yellow emerita sticking out of the sides of it. As it went faster, continued to approach, it also began to slowly surface, and when it did, the boats, the vessels around it in the bay, and the ones seen to try and discover this, sent out to try and stop it or understand it, were sucked into its mass, as it began to warp their shapes and crush them underneath its weight as it slowly floated out of the water. It floated out of the water to about 20 feet above the surface, as it began to suck in more mass from following ships, wrecks beneath the surface, cages of clams, and other stuff on the sea floor, including rocks, loose rocks, stone, and sand. A creature was made. A massive 682-foot tall, or 207-meter tall, creature with 8 legs like a spider, the upper torso of a human, 3 heads, each one with 3 faces, and 6 arms, each arm wielding a massive weapon, a sword, a dagger, a cleaver, even a spear, a book, and finally, a flail. This creature clearly intended to destroy, as it made landfall at around 8:11 that morning in the place known as the Battery, or Battery Park. It destroyed, sucking more mass into itself to grow larger and larger, replacing weaker mass like sand with steel and rebar of buildings. It unleashed its wrath on the city, destroying everything that it could, within sight, within touch, within reach. This creature, this monumental-sized entity, attacked New York without mercy, destroying everything that it touched. It had abilities that only some Omeo mages would have, summoning lightning bolts of red energy from the sky and beams from its eyes to sweep across the city, turning an entire block of New York into a sea of fire. It was intense. The immediate response from the police force was to evacuate, and the US military was notified quickly. But this creature moved so fast, it was hard to pin down just where it was in the city from all the smoke and all the fire. But with advanced technology and targeting systems, they were able to find this creature. This thing was somewhere near the Battery, a little bit far north of it, in town. Their response was immense. Many military bases, floating ships nearby on drills, and anything near the state of New York or the Atlantic Ocean was called to this location, readying battle stations on the ships and armed up for the planes. This thing had no intention of showing mercy, and neither were they. But as the battle began, this thing was shot by rocket and plane and ship and every explosive they could find and throw at it. The damage was dealt, but the creature's body was never destroyed for long, regaining its mass quickly by its ability to reform, or even worse, just becoming larger from some of the buildings which had been destroyed. To give you a scale of how large this creature is at its max of 682 feet, Shin Godzilla is a little bit under half of that height. Half of that height is one of Hollywood's, not even Hollywood anymore, one of the world's greatest and most destructive creatures of all time, seen in movies across the world from Bollywood to Hollywood. It's half of this thing's height, and its destructive capabilities were obvious. But it got worse. This creature could not be stopped by conventional weaponry. Missiles and planes would slow it down and destroy parts of its body, but no matter how much they destroyed, the creature would always reform from the very rubble it was causing, and they were causing with their explosions. 8 hours passed. This creature rampaged in New York for 8 hours, starting at the Battery and finally stopping at the Inwood Hill Park. Its main target was Manhattan Island. The surrounding boroughs were untouched, for the most part, at least for now. It did not step off the island, but the US at the 6th hour realized that it very easily could and continue its rampage. They knew they had something in their arsenal to stop it, as bombs would delay it. But even something as strong as a Moab, a bunker buster, a giant explosion, would simply delay it for a couple of minutes at most. The best they could do is stop it for about 10 minutes, and not even quite stopping it, more slowing its rampage of destruction for 10 minutes. However, if the thing left Manhattan Island, left the main island, and went into the surrounding city of New York, there would be no stopping it. They evacuated the city quickly over the 8 hours, as many people as they could from the surrounding city, and as many as they could from the island. The thing quickly took out the bridges, but people were still off. The city was pretty much abandoned by the 6-hour mark, and the US, in case this thing stepped off the shore of the island and onto the shore of the mainland, were ready to destroy it. They realized the infrastructure damage would be immense, but if this thing got into the mainland of the US and destroyed even more, the entire state of New York could be a threat. They were ready to nuke this thing. They were ready to completely destroy it, vaporize it in the center of a blast that would destroy New York City and the surrounding cities. But it never did. After the 8-hour mark, the creature, standing in the center of Inwood Hill Park, roared to the sky and slowly began to fall apart, turning into a ball of water, sticking to a Buddhist temple once again, and diving into the river nearby. They attempted to follow it. All of their ships and planes monitored the thing as it dived beneath the surface, but even as torpedoes shot at it, even as it was shot, the missiles would slow it down, the torpedoes would blow it to pieces, but these things, this water around it, almost like tiny microbes, tiny creatures, tiny pieces of gelatin, would stop any blast. They retreated into the ocean. They followed it 20 miles off the coast, before eventually it suddenly disappeared without a trace. The death toll was unprecedented. Every building from the Battery to Inwood Hill Park was destroyed. More than a $2 to $3 to $10 billion worth of damage. 6,700,780 people died. It was a travesty. But as the thing left and rescue teams moved into the island, something worse began to show its face. Those who died came back from the dead. Those who died reformed as 6-headed, 6-armed skeletons, standing 10 feet tall, their bodies congealed into corpses, mangled, and these things were angry, and they destroyed everything. What was the cause of this? The wrath. Around the affected area where this creature had attacked, even on the mainland, was a strange aura. To humans, it would cause them to rapidly mutate and turn into mindless yokai. To yokai, it would quickly sap them of Amrita and destroy their body. And to the dead, they would come back as undead. Even corpses which had been gone, dead for hundreds of years, would rise and begin attacking, viciously destroying anything, and combining into these 3-headed, 6-armed skeleton warriors who acted with intention to destroy. There were survivors in the metro station of the city, were being the keyword, as shortly after it was discovered that the wrath had killed or mutated each of them into horrific monsters. They were dead. From the wrath, most of the 6,700,000 dead came. Only about 3 million died in the initial assault, but the wrath killed more than double that. And as the flames of the city finally were squelched by firefighter, the military moved in to destroy these skeletons and quarantine off the city for good. No world power stepped forwards. No one took responsibility or claimed that they did this. No opposing world power that would want to be an enemy of America claimed that this happened. In fact, many people who had contacts within other countries, ministers, members of Congress, even the President of the United States, were receiving phone calls and messages from major countries after this happened, such as China, the UK, Russia, even places like Scotland, Germany, Spain, Mexico, Brazil. Phones from around the world began calling the US, and phones in the US, places like the Pentagon, White House, were ringing non-stop. These countries wanted to know what happened. Was it an experiment gone wrong? Was it some yokai that we didn't know about lurking in the deep sea? Not only that, they found that these countries, once they heard their answers of they don't know and they aren't responsible for it, wanted to aid and try and find this creature. Some say it was a great show of empathy. Others say it was a myth, that this never really happened. But was what was for certain is this was going to be war. These countries did not want the same thing to happen to them. If it could happen to America, it could easily happen to them. They were ready to defend themselves, but some of them were not ready with their weapons and armor. Some of them didn't spend as much money on military as the US did, the highest military spending country. It was obvious to most countries around the world that if they wanted to defend themselves from this, if this ever happened again, they needed to get ready and collaborate with each other, something that some of them never thought they would do. Even countries which had opposing philosophies, opposing cultures, worked together, almost as if they knew this nightmare had just begun. For the first few weeks afterwards, it assumed it would never happen again. But as these undead grew in number, and then were cut down by yokai hunters and horrible things in between, well, it was obvious this is going to happen again somewhere. This much power in a creature that is sentient. It showed intelligence enough to not go onto the mainland, to destroy planes flying above it, to be able to use weapons like a martial art. Its martial arts were intense as well, clearly practiced and trained. He used its weapons with finesse. This creature was alive, smart as a yokai and a human. So the countries came together, pooling all of their importance and their strength and their intelligence together. They created Strike Team Zero. It was meant to be a example, precautionary in case this happened again, serving in the Pacific Ocean as well as the Atlantic Ocean. It was a pool of multiple superpowers funds: Russia, China, Japan, Canada, the US, the UK, Germany. It was a pool of all their funds put together in one military force. Not only that, weapons of warfare to destroy Amrita, which the thing clearly was based off of surely, was formed as well. They needed to destroy this. They needed to stop this thing once and for all. But what they did not know was the capability of whatever this was and what was to come. But what they did know was what they named it. They called this thing a living insurgent, as its ability to insert itself into the population and quickly disappear reminded many of them of the insurgencies which made their rebellious stand across the world in many different countries throughout history. And the undead were known as simply insurgents. Deadly infiltrated the population and destroyed everything. This was only the beginning, however, as soon America would no longer be the target, but one of their allies, the very place that Amrita stemmed from. Soon, Tokyo would know the wrath of the insurgents.
Hi, thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. This was a fun little storytelling video that I wanted to do based on my D&D campaign by the same name, Nioh Dark Rebellion. Thank you so much for coming. If you would like to see more, please do like, comment, and subscribe. The second part will be out soon. We'll be going over Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, which get into a little bit more of the lore that actually shaped the world beyond the lore that actually put the world into the place that it is in the modern era. I hope all of you have an amazing time. This was a blast to make. I really tried to refine myself as a creator with this one. So, I will see you all next time. Goodbye.